The protests over Floyd's murder began in Minneapolis, but quickly exploded into a generalized political challenge to many deeply rooted historical, social, and political conditions that have resulted in an endless repetition of murderous police violence against Black Americans. Like the beating of King a generation earlier, Floyd's murder was a tipping point which galvanized a massive response because it was recorded so everyone could witness it for themselves. In both cases, most viewers understood that these crimes were manifestations of a deeply embedded pattern of racist law enforcement. American capitalism has, from its bloody colonial origins, been soaked with racism, beginning with the genocidal campaign waged against the native inhabitants of the continent and continued by the brutal enslavement of millions of Africans on plantations in the South. We wrote on this back in 1993, and we said, quote, "Racism is rooted in the historical development of capitalism as a world system. It has proved through several centuries to be a useful and flexible tool for the possessing classes. It justified the brutal wars of conquest and genocide which established the European colonial empires. It rationalized the slave trade, which produced the primitive accumulation of capital necessary for the Industrial Revolution. Today, racism in its various guises remains an important ideological mainstay for the capitalist elites, providing a rationale for the barbaric oppression of minorities. Racism explains, for example, why Black people in America fail to get a piece of the American dream one generation after another. Racism has proved integral and necessary for the proper functioning of capitalist society for a variety of reasons. It provides one of the essential axes along which the working class can be divided against itself, encouraging one segment of the proletariat to identify with the exploiters. This impedes the development of class consciousness and undermines the unity necessary to challenge capitalist rule." End of quote. The scope and intensity of the initial reaction to Floyd's murder prompted Minneapolis authorities to promptly fire the cops involved, which is a very unusual move. American police have historically killed citizens with almost total impunity, particularly when their victims are Black or Hispanic. Each year in the United States, there are about 900 and 1,000 people shot and killed by police. Not surprisingly, those killed are disproportionately Black. Also surprising is the fact that of the more than 12,000 people killed by cops in the US since 2005, only 3 officers have been convicted of murder during this period and seen their convictions stand. Protests against Floyd's murder spread rapidly, lasted for weeks, and involved millions of people. The largest was probably a demonstration of 200,000 in Washington, D.C. on 6th of June, a week after the Trump administration unleashed a brutal police attack on a few thousand peaceful protesters in the city, a move that backfired spectacularly. Demonstrations took place in more than 2,000 towns and cities across the US. And what is remarkable is that, of course, this included small towns, places where there is not exactly a tradition of radical protest. Some of these rural towns had protests which were organized by high school students. I've seen several reports where high school students organized demonstrations that drew about 1,000 people in small towns. So one can only hope that these students will join the wave of activists and join the ranks of those who struggle for change. The explosive growth of the protests over Floyd's murder was clearly linked to the heightened level of social anxiety over the COVID-19 pandemic, as well as anticipations of what promises to be a severe and long-lasting economic downturn. with the New York Times predicting a tidal wave of bankruptcies and some 40 million already out of work, the immediate future of American capitalism is not promising. The uncontrolled spread of COVID-19 has discredited the entire ruling elite and the social order it sits atop. Although the chief focus has been on the Trump administration, whose gross incompetence vastly expanded the scope of the disaster. Tens of millions of Americans are now more acutely aware of the complete irrationality of for-profit healthcare and understand that it is necessary to choose between public health and maximizing the profits of the medical industrial complex. The willingness of millions of people to march against racism, despite the risks posed by a pandemic that has already killed over 125,000 Americans, is evidence of a profound desire for a major social and political transformation. Today, with unemployment levels worse than the 1930s, many Americans who long considered themselves part of the solid middle class are suddenly having trouble paying their bills or even getting enough to eat. During the wave of protests that erupted after George Floyd's murder, over 10,000 people were arrested, mostly for curfew violations. During the first week, as the protests grew, the media played up incidents of arson and looting, a tactic that has usually turned public opinion against dissenters, but this time it was very different. When protesters set fire to the police station where Floyd's killer had been dispatched from on 28th of May, many ordinary people inclined to view it not as a criminal act, but rather as a justified blow against murderous cop violence. Given the size of the mobilizations and the depth of the anger, damage to property was rather minor. Some of these incidents were apparently the work of police provocateurs or outright crazies. Revolutionaries seek to direct the justified anger of the masses at the real looters, the Wall Street speculators and other obscenely wealthy parasites who have been massively enriching themselves for decades. The economic rescue packages were advertised as measures to save jobs, but were in fact designed by Wall Street insiders to protect the financial sector, big business and their hangers-on, at the expense of pensioners and those employed by small and medium-sized enterprises. However, most of the money supposedly intended to minimize economic damage from the lockdown actually went to big corporations, which then downsized their workforces. And Chris Hedges actually provided a breakdown of how this money was distributed. He said, the CARES Act handed trillions in funds or tax breaks to oil companies, the airline industry, which alone got 50 billion in stimulus money, the cruise ship industry, 170 billion windfall for the real estate industry, private equity firms, lobbying groups whose political action committees have given 191 million in campaign contributions to politicians in the last 2 decades, the meat industry and corporations that have moved offshore to avoid US taxes. The act allowed the largest corporations to gobble up money that was supposed to go to keep small businesses solvent to pay workers. American billionaires have gotten 434 billion richer since the pandemic. Jeff Bezos, the richest man in the world, whose corporation Amazon paid no federal taxes last year, added 34.6 billion to his personal wealth since the pandemic started. So it is very clear where the money is going, and it's very clear who is benefiting and who is suffering. Now, this is not just the view of left-winger liberal like Chris Hedges. Other people also have similar views. There's a publication here that says how the American worker got fleeced. And it starts with the introduction saying, for decades, bosses have held down wages cut benefits, and stomped on employees' rights. Call it what it is, a heist. This is not from the pages of the Militant or the Socialist Worker newspaper. This is from Bloomberg Business Week. They apparently also have caught onto the fact that things are going so far that Bloomberg is worried that the workers might not take it anymore. This is, of course, their perspective. That is why they are now sounding the alarm bells. They are worried of unrest that can no longer be controlled. I want to talk a little bit about the response of the administration to the protests, which was quite unusual and really alarming when you look at it. On 31st of May, Trump announced that he was designating Antifa, the generic name used by anti-fascists internationally, as a terrorist organization. Many cops interpreted Trump's tough guy law and order talk as a license for assaulting the media. Dozens of American and foreign reporters covering the protests were attacked. A CNN reporter was actually attacked while live on TV. On 1st of June, Trump threatened to quickly solve the problem posed by the persistent expansion of the protests by invoking the 1807 Insurrection Act and dispatching federal troops to states he saw as insufficiently harsh on demonstrators. Trump's slanders about Antifa militants was not merely another manifestation of his white supremacist proclivities. It had a far more sinister purpose, which was revealed in the 1st of June conference call with the state governors, where Trump, Defense Secretary Esper, and US Attorney William Barr outlined their plans to use the tried and true technique of branding protesters terrorists, which had proved so useful to the Obama administration against the Occupy movement in 2011. Trump praised Obama's strategy as a thing of beauty and a template for liquidating the current protests by rounding up their radical left leaders and jailing them for 5 years or 10 years. Here are a few snippets from this conversation that was published. Trump said, "We are strongly looking for arrests. We have to get much tougher. You're going to get over it. We have all the men and women that you need, but people aren't calling them up. You have to dominate. If you don't dominate, you're wasting your time. You're going to run all over you. They're going to run all over you. You look like a bunch of jerks. You have to dominate, and you have to arrest people, and you have to try people, and they have to go to jail for long periods of time. You have everybody on tape. You got to arrest all those people. You got to try them. And if they get 5 years or 10 years, they have to get 5 years or 10 years. That's the president's view of the protesters. He was, of course, assisted in this plan by the Attorney General, Bill Barr, who said, law enforcement response is not going to work unless we dominate the streets, as the president said. We have to control the streets. If we treat these as demonstrations, the police are pinned back, guarding places, and don't have the dynamic ability to go out and arrest the troublemakers. The structure we're going to use is the Joint Terrorist Task Force, which I know most of you are familiar with. Tried and true system. It's worked for domestic and homegrown terrorists. And we're going to employ that model. It already integrates your state and local people, and it's intelligence driven, and it will go operational. So the Attorney General, who you would think has some affinity for legal procedures, actually doesn't want these demonstrations to be treated as legal demonstrations. He wants to deal with it in a similar way you deal with domestic terrorists. This is where the administration is heading. And it was all topped off by Defense Secretary Esper, who said, I think the sooner that you mask and dominate the battle space, the quicker this dissipates and we get back to the right normal. You wonder what the right normal is. Presumably the right normal is when cops go around shooting innocent people and nobody protests. Trump's notions about using the military to suppress popular dissent and round up the radical left recall the many anti-democratic interventions engineered by US imperialism abroad. But in this case, the high command of the US military refused to go along with what they clearly considered an irrational, unnecessary, and potentially disastrous adventure. The central public figure of opposition was former Defense Secretary Mad Dog Mattis. Somewhat surprising, but there you go. Mattis criticized Trump for failing to unite the American people. Instead, he tries to divide us, he said. To underline the seriousness of his charge and signal the determination of the military to act if necessary, Mattis invoked another leader who had ruled by dividing rather than uniting, recalling that during World War II, quote, the Nazi slogan for destroying us was divide and conquer. Our American answer is, in union there is strength, end of quote. Brushing aside the petty vandalism of a small number of lawbreakers, Mattis praised the tens of thousands of people of conscience, as he called them, who had participated in the recent protests. The warning issued to the ostensible US commander-in-chief that he no longer had the confidence of the officer corps was promptly echoed by a variety of other former senior military figures. And Defense Secretary Esper, who was so keen on dominating the battle space, signaled that he got the message by immediately announcing that he opposed to the use of active duty troops against demonstrators. It is hard to exaggerate the significance of these events in which the entire top echelon of the US military agreed to publicly slap down a sitting president. Now, Trump retains much of his core support, but his law and order message failed to resonate. People simply have other problems. Tens of millions of US citizens are dependent on food banks for survival and unable to afford basic health care. There's much anxiety among people who previously considered themselves part of the middle class, many of whom are doubtless observant enough to notice that funding foreign military adventures or bailing out banks and corporations is never a problem for the US government. The current wave of Black Lives Matter protests express more than a desire to put an end to racist police violence against blacks. They also represent a developing recognition by millions of Americans of all colors and ethnicities that the growth of social inequality over the past several decades has become intolerable. The white youth who have made up the majority of many recent Black Lives Matter demonstrations are expressing not only their revulsion at racist police violence, but also anxiety about their own lives and uncertain futures. Across North America, police culture tends to be pretty consistently racist, misogynist, and homophobic. Marxists are opposed to police unions, which tend to be hotbeds of reaction and advocate their exclusion from trade union federations and all other working class associations. The issue of the class nature of the police has often been a point of contention within the socialist movement in the past. Reformists tend to view police, prison guards, immigration corps, etc. as simply workers in uniform. We disagree. We raised the slogan, cops out of the unions. And I was very pleased when I recently read that one of Seattle's labor councils actually voted to expel the cop union. This happened after the cops failed to take a clear position on racism. No surprise there. And the result of this was that they were excluded from the labor council. And almost as if to underscore the correctness of this move, the cops at the end of June cleared the autonomous chop zone of protesters in the center of Seattle. Now, it should be noted that apparently the executive statement of the Labor Council left the door open for the cop union to return at a later stage. So clearly that is very soft and not quite right. However, I think what it shows is that there are people today in the union movement who are willing to take a stand and draw a class line against the cops. And I think it is the duty of all trade union militants to support these moves in order to get the cops out of the unions. On reforming and defunding, I want to talk a little bit about, because there has been a lot of talk about reforming, defunding the cops. The more sophisticated elements of the bourgeoisie have been scrambling to come up with plausible sounding proposals for reforming America's brutally racist tradition of policing. The ideas range from imposing national training standards and requiring cops to record all interactions with body cameras, to more ambitious calls for breaking the power of the police unions, defunding police, and even disbanding particularly notorious police forces. While some proposals have a radical ring, in practice, they will not result in any sort of qualitative transformation. Defunding means reallocating some portion of the police budget to expanding social services. In Minneapolis, the city council recently voted to disband the existing police force because of its deeply embedded culture of racist brutality. Such a measure was actually carried out in Camden, New Jersey a few years ago. The reconstituted police force, which included 100 of the former cops from the disbanded outfit, is reportedly somewhat less abusive, but nothing fundamental has changed. Decades of police reform have demonstrated that even with liberal black police chiefs and progressive prosecutors, little really changes. This is because at its core, the function of the police is to serve and protect the beneficiaries of a social system which is profoundly inequitable. The laws and regulations that the police are required to enforce are designed to protect the right to exploit and oppress working people, with the harshest blows inevitably directed at poor black people who have historically been forcibly segregated at the bottom of American society. Marxists are advocates of the revolutionary reconstruction of society and the destruction of the repressive apparatus that defends the capitalist social order. But this does not mean we are not prepared to make concrete, generally negative demands on the capitalist state that are in the interests of the oppressed. We call for dropping all proceedings against everyone arrested in connection with the protests against George Floyd's murder. We also support banning police use of chokeholds, a move that is presently being implemented in many jurisdictions. Revolutionists are in favor of disarming the police, as well as every limited or partial step in that direction. For example, we endorse calls to reverse the militarization of US police forces that has taken place under the 1033 program, which was signed into law back in the days by Bill Clinton. It is important, however, to distinguish between demands that benefit workers and the oppressed from those that promote the illusion that the major problems that they confront can be solved by anything short of a socialist revolution that will overthrow the existing social system and smash up the coercive state apparatus that protects it. The Democratic Party has historically been the political mechanism through which many of capitalism's victims have been reconciled to a system of multiple overlapping forms of injustice. But confidence in the possibility of achieving significant change through electoral channels has been declining in recent years, particularly among young people. America's black bourgeoisie has a very different objective interests than those of the plebeian youth whose anger and resentment it would like to channel into support for the Democratic Party. There's a good description of their function. Margaret Kimberley from the Black Agenda report identified the black misleaders who attempted to drive a wedge between angry black demonstrators and the white youth who rallied to their cause. She wrote, Atlanta Mayor Keisha Lance Bottoms was among the worst. She accused protesters of disgracing her city, George Floyd's memory and Martin Luther King's legacy, all in one fell swoop. She told them, go home. According to Madame Mayor, every protester was snatching liquor, setting fires, and pulling knives on the police. The underlings of their patrons are afraid. The underlings and their patrons are afraid, she wrote. They know that if young black and white people find common cause, they may march for other reasons too. They may lead general strikes, demand an end to war, or try to resurrect the Occupy movement. It is better to cast aspersions now instead of risking needed change that would undermine their positions, end of quote. So to conclude, the current crisis of legitimacy of the US bourgeois order results from the unusual intersection of growing anxiety about an already contracting economy perched on the edge of a precipice, the manifestly incompetent handling of the COVID-19 pandemic, and the sudden and completely unanticipated mass mobilizations against police racism and its white supremacist roots. These developments have created the preconditions for continuing social turmoil and potentially the re-emergence of pro-working class politics on a significant scale. Revolutionaries must seek ways to channel rising discontent into recognition of the necessity for developing organized political activity, with the objective of creating a labor party centered on the working class and completely independent from the capitalists, committed to fight for an entirely different egalitarian social order. Racism, poverty, imperialist war abroad, and brutal police repression at home cannot be ended by unorganized, spontaneous actions, however militant, even when carried out by millions of people. Only through forging a multi-ethnic and multiracial workers' party can the interests of the victims of racist oppression, as well as women, the homeless, the unemployed, and all the others oppressed by life under capitalism, be given effective political expression. At this point, there is a great opportunity, but no plausible leadership, not even an approximation of a nucleus of one. The best that can be hoped for is that elements among America's several thousand would-be revolutionaries will recognize that the present moment represents an opportunity to engage a lot of new people in leftist activity, both the study of the history and theory of the socialist movement and direct involvement in practical struggles, such as strike support or union organizing drives, or the breaking up of fascist gatherings. The broad expansion of this sort of activity could help prepare the ground for the emergence of a socialist labor party independent of the bosses and their democratic political operatives. Thank you for listening.
Thank you, Christoph. So as I said, if people want to indicate with the raise hand option, which you should have at the bottom of your screen, your Zoom screen there, I will take people to speak for a round of discussion. People can try and keep to about 3 minutes, but I have no one yet, so people can indicate if they want to speak. Okay, I've got one there. Okay, Dara, if people want to indicate, please indicate, and I'll just note you down as I see you. Okay, Dara, you ready to go? Can't hear you, Dara. You're not muted. Now you're muted. No, you're not muted.
I'm unmuted now.
Now you're good, yeah.
Okay, cool. So I'm Dara, supporter of the Bolshevik tendency in Britain, and I just wanted to speak as a comrade in London, seeing from our perspective across the pond. So something we've seen in Britain is that since the murder of George Floyd has been the realization of the fact that the British establishment is not innocent either, especially given their origins in setting up the US state. But the UK police was found to be institutionally racist over 20 years ago, when in their handling of the racist murder of Stephen Lawrence. And yet the policing of predominantly black working class communities remain fundamentally unchanged. Black people are 9 times more likely to be stopped and searched by cops in England and Wales. They're twice as likely to die in police custody and more than twice as likely to have force involved in their deaths. And since 1990, we've seen 1,743 people dead following police contact in England and Wales, and a disproportionate number of those people, 10%, were black. And in none of these cases has a single Bolshevik cop been convicted of their murder. That's despite a series of highly critical inquest findings, including findings of unlawful killings by inquest juries. So we've also recently seen the institutional racism, especially by the Metropolitan Police, in the policing of the UK BLM Black Lives Matter protests.
1 minute to go.
And on 6th of June 2020, mounted police charged anti-racist protesters in central London, and others were kettled for several hours. And when they began to release people from the kettle, legal observers reported that this was initially on the condition that individuals had images taken of them and their personal details taken down by police, both in direct contravention of their civil rights. And on the following weekend, 13th of June, when far-right thugs assembled in central London, there were videos of far-right thugs attacking cops. Meanwhile, a 16-year-old black student, only known as Gerard, was attacked by a group of far-right thugs with a broken glass bottle and nearly blinded. When he found a police officer and asked for help, he was subsequently subjected to a stop and search. So this has really lifted the veil of the nature of the British ruling class and their paid thugs. But as Christoph mentioned, this has often been a contentious point for the left. As a former member of the British section of
3 minutes, could you wind it up, please?
Yeah, I'll wind up now. As a former member of the British section of the Committee for Workers' International, previously the militant tendency, their political tradition is that of cops being workers in uniform. And along with Leon Trotsky, I take the opposite view. The worker who becomes a policeman in the service of the capitalist state is a bourgeois cop, not a worker. And serious revolutionaries who claim to stand in the tradition of the Bolshevik Party should be prepared to draw the lessons from the recent protests in order to explicitly repudiate the idea that cops or screws are part of the workers' movement. Thank you.
There, I've got two people ready to speak. That's Roxanne and Jason. If anyone else wants to speak, even if it's just to make a comment, just like Peter there, put your hand up and I'll take you as I see you. So Roxanne.
Hi. Thank you. Yeah, I just wanted to come back to the need for a mass revolutionary working class party that Christoph mentioned at the end of his presentation. The urgent and vital tool that we need to uproot the brutal system that has created all of this mess. And to link that to one of the debates that's going on at the moment around identity politics, or at least, you know, that debate has never really gone away, but it's more prevalent than ever at the moment. And to make the link between the two, because I think people are becoming more and more aware that these two things are just not compatible. I mean, for one thing, we know this kind of party that we need to build. Firstly, it has to be composed of people of all genders and ethnicities and races, as well as being armed with a consistently revolutionary program. And obviously no one group of people is going to be able to overthrow capitalism single-handedly, and nor can a revolutionary party that doesn't contain representatives from all those groups do its job. So I thought it was quite interesting, you know, all around the world, a lot of people have been quoting the brilliant Black Panther Fred Hampton recently, you know, on all the demos and the protests on social media. And I found it really encouraging and a good sign for how things are shifting towards an understanding that the system itself needs to change, you know, and that people are examining the underlying cause of the kind of institutional racism and the systemic inequality that led to George Floyd's murder, and so many other murders like it. And of course, it's that famous quote at the end of a kind of chunk of famous quote that is often used for Fred Hampton, that we're not going to fight racism we are going to fight racism with solidarity. Let me get it right. We say you don't fight capitalism with black capitalism, you fight capitalism with socialism. So Fred Hampton, rather than promoting black nationalist identity politics, had instead come to understand, to see that a class-based approach to fighting oppression was the only strategy that could win.
30 seconds.
It was for this dangerous idea that the state assassinated him in his bed when he was 21 years old. But one myth that I think it's important to debunk, and maybe I won't have time to do that right now, but just touch on the idea that it's only that Trotskyists or other leftists only concentrate on class, and that we don't recognize other different experiences of black and Asian workers and ethnic minorities versus experiences of white workers. Now, of course, we do recognize the primacy of class.
That's 3.
So I'll just end by saying that even though that's the case, that is not mutually exclusive with acting as what Lenin called the tribune of the people, where we recognize the different experiences of different races. Thank you.
Okay, got Jason next, and then following that there's Peter and Bryden. Peter and Bryden, I'm going to promote you to be panelists, but you'll just sit there waiting for Jason.
Yeah, in the US, there were really 2 origins of the cops. The first in the southern slaveholding states had their roots in the slave patrols, which were the squadrons that were made up of white volunteers empowered to use vigilante tactics to enforce laws related to slavery. And these slave patrols were often funded by the plantation owners. They hunted down escaped slaves, crushed uprisings, and also enforced other violations of plantation rules, like against slaves caught stealing or out at night without a pass. These slave patrols arose in South Carolina by the early 1700s, and by the time of John Adams became the second president of the US, every slave state had them. They could forcefully enter people's homes under the suspicion that someone was sheltering a runaway slave. And then the other origin, which is equally racist in many ways, were in the centralized municipal police departments that formed right before the Civil War in Boston, New York City, Albany, Chicago, Philadelphia. This was the Gang of New York era, where these were enforcers for the local machine bosses. And their job was really not to prevent crime in the way that it's pitched today, but to enforce property rights, to oppose strikes and act as strike breakers, and to keep immigrants and the lumpen poor down. In both cases, what you have are groupings of poor whites who are co-opted to be a part of the armed repressive apparatus of the state against their own class interests, and essentially crossing the class line, becoming subordinated to the ruling class and their willing tools on the basis of the white skin privilege identification, which then in turn, because of the racism, has negative effects against the entire working class, both black and white workers. Police corruption and violence were endemic in both the North and the South. And the few Black Americans who were allowed to join the police force in the North were usually assigned to Black neighborhoods, faced discrimination on the jobs, and were expected to demonstrate their loyalty to the Blue Brotherhood by being even more brutal than their white counterparts. The slave patrols were formally dissolved in the South after the Civil War ended, but you had the defeated Confederate Army Officer Corps establishing the Ku Klux Klan. It drew its rank and file from the same sort of people who had been members of the slave patrols before, and they put into place black codes and apartheid-like conditions of separation. Even though the 14th Amendment in 1868 made the black codes illegal, by the time you have the final compromise in 1876, the post-war compromise, when Rutherford B. Hayes, in a disputed election, was finally agreed that he would be president. He was the Republican, and had formally supported Reconstruction, but it was agreed in the power brokering that the Dixiecrats would not contest the election, providing the federal troops were withdrawn from the South, which allowed the KKK to reimpose the apartheid-like conditions and set up the next 50, 60 years of the new Jim Crow in the South. And that's just sort of some quick context about what's sort of unique about the US police. And I know we've always had a slogan here and you really do see the overlap in terms of the clans and the cops in the South historically, was the cops and the Klan go hand in hand, or blue by day, white by night. And that really did become the post-Reconstruction defeat order of the South throughout the Jim Crow era. Done.
Thanks, Jason. Now we've got Peter.
Hello. I first of all want to commend Christoph on his presentation. It was very good. I think that just to add to Roxanne's comment, like Britain, Toronto and Canada, we've seen no less in terms of racist police behavior. The most recent instance, of course, is a Muslim man, Ijaz Chowdhury. He was his family called 911 because they were concerned he wasn't taking his medication for schizophrenia. Police went into his apartment. He ended up being shot several times, and killed. And of course, there's no charges against any of the police involved, etc. I mean, it's to say it's a pattern is to say the obvious. But even so, the idea that this, as someone else has referred to, the old normal of where it's okay to kill the working poor and oppressed is okay, is very much part of police culture up in Canada. I think one dimension of the upheaval, I think, and Christoph spoke well to this, is the real anxiety in the not just people of color in the working class, but the working class as a whole is facing a very vicious attack by the rulers. I mean, aside from the billionaires getting many more billions, we see for example Elon Musk at the Tesla factory, forcing his workers to go to work even though there's a lockdown order in that county in California. Any workers who decided to follow that county directive were in fact fired or suspended because they refused to work. So, so that's one small example. But we've seen breakouts of COVID-19 at meatpacking plants amongst migrant workers who are fruit and vegetable pickers, auto plants, personal support workers in old age homes, where there's of course the complete absence of personal protective equipment, and the bosses have made it very clear that their well-being is of no concern of theirs as long as shareholders get their money. And I mean, I think that people are beginning to see that that the existing society is irrational. I mean, we've seen a recent instance of where Budget Rent-A-Car has gone bankrupt, and despite that, the company has actually issued more stock, and its stock prices bumped up from $1 to $5. Based on pure speculation. I mean, it's quite clearly a social order that cannot provide basic needs for people, and I think that it will create renewed interest. Not just, I mean, obviously, aside from the social people, we're seeing renewed interest in alternatives to the capitalist world order. I'll leave it at that for now. Thank you.
Thanks, Peter. Brian?
How's it going? That was really good, Christoph. Recap what's going on here in America. I just wanted to add real quick because you mentioned Bill Barr, the Attorney General, and something that's kind of been erased from the public memory in America is the Iran-Contra affair. And Bill Barr was the Attorney General for H.W. Bush and got pretty much as a reason nobody went to prison for Iran-Contra. And I just think he's going to be probably an important figure here soon. I mean, he already is. And as far as, criminal activity going unaccounted. And I just wanted to add in that to be a name to kind of have in people's conscience, because he's really slippery that way. But that was really all I wanted to add.
Thank you, Brian. We don't have anyone else indicating they want to speak. I've actually got a small question, not actually for Christoph, but for, I see two more speakers there. Just a small question for other people who are present, particularly anyone living in the United States. I remember during the early days of the COVID outbreak, there were some examples of working class struggle against the attempts by business to push ahead and put workers in dangerous positions. So the Amazon, and there were some industrial action by bus workers, I believe, in not wanting to transport people. So I was wondering if there's been any fusing of those two things, because they kind of ran into each other. The big uprisings and mobilizations against Black Lives Matter have kind of taken over that space, but clearly COVID is still there, and it's still a major problem in the United States. I was wondering if there are any people who are aware of any examples of political struggle by the organised working class. I've got two more. First of all, I've got Kathy. Kathy? Or it might be Tom.
Unmute. Yes, it is Tom.
Tom.
Am I on?
Yes.
Okay, good. One of the things that I think is Christoph talked about, but perhaps is not fully appreciated, particularly outside of the U.S., is what a dramatic turnaround there's been in particularly white popular opinion regarding these protests and regarding more broadly the history of racism in the U.S. This is really enormous and unprecedented. And at its height, the Wall Street Journal reported, as we noted in our statement, that not only were a majority of whites, popular opinion was running 2-to-1, that they were much more worried about police murder than protester violence. That's unprecedented. Not only that, but a majority of Republicans and a majority of white Americans took that view. Unprecedented. And this is pretty consistently represented in the polls, and it was certainly represented in the streets, where a large percentage, probably a majority of those protesting in all the 2,000 municipalities that it took place were white, predominantly young. That's very significant. And Trump understood that significance. And that's why it was so important to get a grip on this, not because there were some windows being broken and the odd building had been torched. In fact, less of that was taking place as these grew in dimensions, but because it was a scary prospect. And Trump is not a sophisticated thinker, and he decided that that they would dominate the battle space. His cronies agreed with him. As Christoph reported, Bill Barr said, yes, we won't treat these as demonstrations. We'll treat these as a giant terrorist attack, as if it's a column of people driving tanks and machine guns coming to devastate American society. We have to stand up and protect ourselves against terrorism. And it's really a scenario that's out of Latin America, as Christoph alluded. It's pretty much Pinochet. Now, one of the things,
One minute.
The CNN released this transcript. It didn't get picked up by anybody hardly, including even in the radical left, where Trump is saying we need to put all the radical left leaders in jail for 5 to 10 years. And Barr is saying, yes, we won't treat these as demonstrations. We'll treat them as terrorist attacks. Round up, basically martial law is our response. The other thing which is really astounding and significant, and again, I haven't seen it even picked up by the radical left, is the fact that the template for this was provided by the Obama administration. This is how they handled Occupy. They declared Occupy to be a terrorist conspiracy and suppressed them simultaneously across the U.S., a joint terrorist operation. This is highly significant. The other thing that's highly significant, which Christoph did discuss, is the revolt by the generals. Basically, the U.S. military got together, collaborated with each other secretly, and all agreed that they would not follow the instructions of the commander-in-chief, and if necessary, they would arrest and imprison him. That's the significance of when the Mad Dog Mattis, in his pivotal statement, drew a parallel. So this is an unprecedented development in several dimensions, and I think it's not fully appreciated. But the significance of it is that it's embedded in the population, and how it will unfold remains to be seen. But there is certainly enormous potential here for very major and continuing social change.
Thank you. Next, we've got Hans-Peter.
Hi, yeah, I'm Hans-Peter, supporter of the Bolshevik tendency. The question concerning class struggle against COVID and the current situation, I think that I'm aware of two somewhat significant developments there. Small scale, probably not profoundly integrated with the movement to the best of my knowledge, but still noteworthy. One was in Minneapolis. There were individual bus drivers, unionized bus drivers, who refused to transport protesters who were arrested by the police and meant to be shipped to prisons, and they refused to do that job, which caused the police obviously some headache. The other one that is more large scale and, funnily enough, mostly entirely ignored by the bourgeois media, was the ILWU port shutdown of the entire West Coast, the Juneteenth strike, which I think is highly significant, not so much because it's symbolic at the moment, unfortunately. It's not, hasn't had any lasting impact to the best of my understanding, but because it shows the social power that the working class has. And that lies in the trade unions and the struggle against the reformist trade union bureaucracy. And what's so important about it is that the ILWU has historically struck repeatedly against police violence. So they went on strike to defend Mumia Abu-Jamal when the US government tried to pass the death penalty against him. They went on strike after the murder of Oscar Grant in 2010. And they went on strike against the war in Iraq in, I think, May Day 2007. And now, as I said, Juneteenth, they shut down the entire West Coast. And again, what's all equally important is it points to the integrated struggle between white, black, and other ethnic minority workers in the US as the way forward.
1 minute.
But the ILWU is profoundly diverse, and it plays a role in the BT's origins in that it organized in 1984 the longshoremen boycott of the Netloy Kimberley in the struggle against African apartheid, which had a profound impact and was acknowledged by Nelson Mandela as one of the contributing factors of bringing down apartheid in South Africa. So strategically, revolutionaries need to operate in the trade unions in order to oust the reformist trade union leadership and replace it with a revolutionary one with a strategy of using industrial action as a means to build towards socialist revolution. Finish.
Okay, we don't have anyone else indicating they want to speak, so I'll go back to Christoph for a summary. I'll give you about 10 minutes, Christoph.
Okay, thank you. I'm not sure I need all the time, but yes, thank you for those thoughts and contributions. I want to talk a little bit about the fact that although there is, of course, massive social movement and it is going in a good direction, it does not solve all the problems in terms of the required leadership or even the necessary organization. And I want to kind of sketch that by giving a few examples of what it is like, what you encounter when you go to some of these protests and how it varies in consciousness. Now, it's pretty much common knowledge now, it seems, that people talk about and think about the two pandemics in the United States. One is COVID-19 and the other one is racism. They are both widespread and hard to get rid of. And people are talking about it as something that is now clear to everybody. It is no longer a kind of inside knowledge. It is acknowledged and people are no longer willing to put up with it. Neither of them. And I think it is interesting to see that the Democrats, who traditionally have been, partially organizing demonstrations, partially trying to steer them, have not always been that successful in taking control. It varies really quite a lot. We went to a protest last month in Troy, New York, which was quite large. Close to 10,000 people marched, and I do not recall a single speaker suggesting that what we should do is vote Democrats in order to solve the problems of the two pandemics. Not one person advocated voting for the Democrats. There wasn't even a hint of it. There was a lot of talk about police brutality and mass black incarceration. Not so much talk about how the Democrats are going to help us with all these problems. And I think that was interesting. We didn't have speakers advocating the revolutionary overthrow of capitalism either, but given the fact that the Democrats are usually the go-to, the absence of a positive reference to them was significant, I would say. So there's a certain distance from the traditional leadership and more of a self-organizing by a lot of people. And the other thing is, we went to much smaller protest in Albany not that long ago, and I was going around distributing some of our literature, and I was approached by one of the organizers who politely but firmly suggested I should stop distributing my literature. Now, I'm pretty sure that he was linked to the Democratic Party and didn't like the idea of communists going around putting the wrong ideas into people's heads. So that's another aspect of the attempt by the Democrats to control what they can control, to keep the lid on. Things shouldn't get too radical because things could get out of hand and people might forget to vote for Biden in the end. So there is that aspect where I think the Democrats are worried, and they are right to be worried because nobody is enthusiastic about them anymore for good reasons. Definitely not with the current contender. And I think we will see how it pans out in the elections, but it is significant that people are not automatically running into the arms of the Democratic Party at the moment. So I'll leave it at that.
Okay, thank you, Christoph. So the plan was to have another round of discussion if people wanted to say anything else. I don't have anyone with their raised hand indication. I've got one now. So if people do want to talk again, we'll take the same procedure, around 3 minutes or so. So Jason.
Hi, can you hear me now? I was having some connection problems, sorry. I think what Christoph was mentioning about the way in which, at least at a formal leadership level, Black Lives Matters is connected to the Democratic Party or co-opted, which is not to say that every Black Lives Matter protest or every local is connected to the Democratic Party, but we had that sort of bizarre attack 4 years ago on Sanders by a group of Black Lives Matters hostile people in the audience who were pretty clearly shilling for Hillary Clinton. And I think it's important to know that Joe Biden came from Delaware, and I had mentioned a lot about the Southern racism, but obviously the racist conditions also continued in the North. A lot of it took the form of discrimination in housing, ghettoizing blacks in northern cities, and in the suburbs, they developed these lily white areas that were sundown towns where blacks would be harassed if seen walking or driving at night by the local cops. Biden came from this sort of an environment, and even though formally he had begun his career as a champion of civil rights and then later became vice president under Obama, one of his first truly historically significant votes in Congress led to the defeat of busing. He had begun as an advocate for busing, and upon being elected to the Senate had switched sides and voted against busing. So, you know, I think it's important to understand that the Democratic Party has and always will be a graveyard for social struggle in the US. Done.
Thank you, Jason. Okay, I've got a couple there. Take Bride and then Kathy.
Yeah, I was just going to mention a couple days ago, Trump had a speech at the Mount Rushmore here because a lot of Black Lives Matter, I think in order for them to avoid talking about material, for politicians at least, to talk about material conditions and changing those, especially for Black communities, or defunding the police and funding social services. Is there's a lot of symbolic wars that are going on, culture wars, and Trump loves this stuff. But in his speech at the Mount Rushmore, and the reason he held his speech there was because people, the Mount Rushmore was essentially made after they slaughtered Lakota that were native to Mount Rushmore. And before Mount Rushmore, I'm spacing the name off the top of my head, but it was a tribute to their ancestors. He actually mentioned Marxism in that speech, and I think it's because he warned about Marxists, and I think it has to do with the Black Lives Matter founder and co-founder have a video out there where they call themselves Marxist organizers, and that's really freaked the right out here in America. And at our local Defund the Police rally we had, there were a lot of really vulgar things being said, anti-Semitic deals, and just being called Bolsheviks and Marxists and communists. And I think a large reason of that is the right thinks that Black Lives Matter here in America is a class-conscious Marxist movement. When, I think Christoph kind of touched on it. It's largely a lot of, there's class-conscious elements to Black Lives Matter here, but it's largely been co-opted by Democrats and liberals. And I don't know exactly where I can go with this from here, but I'll stop now.
Okay, thanks, Brian. Okay, Kathy or Tom? And then after that, I've got someone who's phoning in. I don't have a name for you, and then Peter again. Kathy.
It's actually Tom.
Tom again, okay.
Yeah, Tom again. One of the things which Christoph didn't touch on that we did address in our statement is the prospect of making serious progress in a revolutionary direction, taking advantage of this opportunity, which, we don't know how long it's going to exist. It's a very severe crisis in the US right now, with COVID running out of control, with the American bourgeoisie and large key elements of the way that that society's been organized for a long time, racism, police repression, privatized medicine, the whole idea that everybody is a rugged individual. A lot of that has been shredded by recent events, COVID. And one of the things which Christoph did talk about, but which we should all be aware of, is that we're on the edge of a very rapid downward descent economically. There's going to be a lot more poverty. There are going to be a lot more people thrown out of their jobs. There are going to be a lot of people losing their houses, a lot of people unable to pay their rent, thrown out of their apartments, etc. I mean, it is a very, very serious situation, and it's, I think, underappreciated. In order to make serious progress in that situation, there needs to be some developments within the layer of sort of the hardened leftist groups and the broader milieu of people who are sympathetic, oriented towards socialism or pro-socialist. Bernie Sanders supporters, DSA, et cetera, would be part of that category. The core around which something viable could be organized that might turn into a mass labor party would certainly have to involve significant layer, or at least a few hundred, a few thousand people who have some political experience already, and many of whom are with different sort of tendencies in the left. There hasn't been a lot going on in the American left in the last decade or two. I think that we can see there's some motion, there's some development politically. This mass explosion has made people think about things in ways that they perhaps didn't. I think that a lot of people who would be associated with Black Lives Matter must be very impressed by the participation of the white students and the willingness of white workers to get involved.
One minute.
That represents significant development. I think also within the far left, there have been right-wing deviations, so to speak, which Christoph touched on, of viewing cops as workers and fellow workers that we should be friendly with and want in the union movement. That is somewhat discredited. That's not a very popular thing right now. And not only is it good to score points, but it's more important to change people's consciousness. Organized leftists who may have thought that that made sense should be thinking about it, and that may open some space for some developments. And conversely, there have also been a kind of sectarian position on some of this. We have raised in the past the demand jail the killer cops, and there have been leftists, some of whom are rather close to us historically, Spartacus League and the Internationalist Group, who've taken the view that this is impossible. It can't possibly be achieved, and that to demand jailing a killer cop who's murdered a black youth or worker, that creates illusions. Well, obviously it doesn't. That in fact has been achieved. So again, one would hope that there would be some beginning of some changing in consciousness of some of those people, and perhaps out of this we can begin to make some progress in the direction of putting something together which is larger and more significant than anything that currently exists.
Thank you, Tom. Okay, Peter, before I take you on, I'm just going to take this person who's dialed in. I don't know your name now, I've just got a phone number, but you should be able to talk now.
Yes, that's Elazar from Idaho speaking. I was at a Black Lives Matter demonstration with a group of youth that I work with, or actually who work with me also, and they were asked to be defense guards at this demonstration. And fascists mobilized, as well as Trump supporters, in very large numbers. So when I say fascists, I mean people with swastikas on their biceps, and they were armed, openly armed, with automatic pistols sitting in holsters on their side. I don't know what percent, but I saw quite a number with armed fascists. So and they were also, I was one of the speakers, and they were harassing and heckling. So I was thinking, given the context of what Christoph, and especially that young man talked about the origins of the police very, very well, what should our slogans and strategies be? For example, even as bad as the conservatives, the trade union movement up here in Idaho, once one of the most radical of all, how can we build trade union defense guards for our demonstrations, which would prevent vandalism? Because when we had the Oscar Grant demonstration, Longshore provided the marshals, and there was no antisocial behavior whatsoever. And what there was in Oakland, a lot of it was photographed later as police provocateurs. So I think with labor defense guards from unions, we can minimize the stupidity of a Trump trying to get the military to attack the demonstrations as terrorists. And so I would like to hear from the speaker what slogans, what should be on our banners, and what type of regroupment struggles we should be going through to unite the left that Tom was speaking about, to strike together and defend our positions, what little we have. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Elazar. Peter.
Thank you. I think one of the things that have become very apparent, and this is to follow up on Christoph's comment about how it's hard to see anybody at these demonstrations embracing the Democratic Party or advocating for voting for it, I think is largely because it's shown its utter bankruptcy. We've just had a situation where the Supreme Court has denied women working for religious institutions any access to birth control. We've had 14 consecutive weeks where over 1 million unemployment claims have been made in the United States. And Congress has just taken a vacation as the top-up to unemployment benefits are about to expire. I mean, it's, you know, and, you know, when you look at Biden, I mean, aside from certain, you know, cognitive demission play there, you know, this is a guy who said he will veto any act that calls for Medicare for all. This is also a guy who said, you know what the alternative to having police shoot people to kill is having police shoot people, you know, so they go for their appendages, like their legs and, you know, and their arms. So the alternative between the Democrats and Republicans is, you know, employment-based healthcare, which is completely useless now. And, you know, you get shot, you know, police get to still shoot first and ask questions later. They just, you know, perhaps will shoot for less lethal targets of the body. Like, I mean, so, I mean, it's the utter bankruptcy of the Democratic Party is apparent, and I think it's, you know, I think one of the things that Sanders has done us a favor is to show that there's no area in the Democratic Party, not only for any kind of call for really substantive change or, you know, calls for social upheaval and overturn of the capitalist order. There's not even room for social democratic politics. I mean, so despite, you know, Sanders' acquiescence to the Biden campaign. So I think that there is a real opportunity here for revolutionary socialist politics, and I think that
1 minute.
And I think that that's you know, current events have underlined the failure of the American model. I mean, so I'll leave it at that. Thank you.
Thank you, Peter. We don't have any other speakers. I'll go back to Christoph unless someone wants to indicate they want to speak. Seeing none, back to Christoph.
Okay. Black Lives Matter as a kind of Marxist-inspired movement. I wish it was the case. I don't think it is, but it is, of course, interesting that this should be used, or an attempted smear of that type is being tried. I mean, similar things were tried with the civil rights movement, and I guess back in the 50s and 60s, that was somewhat more successful. You could put some people off by trying to depict civil rights activists as, you know, communist-led or communist-inspired people who try to undermine the freedom of the United States. The thing is, though, it didn't work back then, and it certainly doesn't work today, because if you look at the shift in opinion over the last few years, more and more people in opinion polls indicate a preference for socialism over capitalism. I think for people under 30 in the United States, the majority somehow see socialism as more progressive than capitalism. That is quite significant. Of course, when a lot of these people say socialism, they mean probably something like the Swedish model of social democracy, where you have capitalism with some level of high taxes to fund social services and low levels of poverty, which, you know, was a model that a lot of social democrats prescribed to for a long time. However, even that distorted view of socialism, I think, indicates that people see the destructive nature of capitalism and are reaching for an avenue that can lead away from this concept of everyone for themselves and maximize the profit at all costs. So I think that is, of course, encouraging that this shift is taking place, and the shift we discussed today, that more and more people, including white people, are willing to stand up against police brutality and racism, the pandemic that we are dealing with in the United States. I want to finish by briefly addressing the question that Alazar raised as best as I can. Now, of course, there is a need for trade union defense guards, as Alazar correctly said. And I think we, both in the unions and outside of unions, on protests, we should raise those slogans that call for black and labor defense guards against police brutality, against threats by fascists, because we need to drive the message home that it is us who need to organize in our defense. We cannot leave it to anybody else because nobody else is going to do it for us. So we need to be very clear that we need to rely on our own forces. And our own forces can grow by trying to bring people in for concrete actions that are broadly understood as in the interests of the vast majority. This can be protection for Black Lives Matter protests. This can be an attempt to disrupt a fascist rally. In those instances, we should advocate what we call a united front, have different labor, socialist community groups come together and agree on a simple strategy that could be as simple as, stop the KKK on day X. And we mobilize with that in mind and with that purpose. We do not pretend we agree on everything. We're not going to say we're going to vote for Biden or some other candidate. All of that stuff people can discuss as well. But as an organizing focus, the united action should just say, let's stop them, let's smash them up, let's disrupt them. We need to focus on that. That will bring in people with all kinds of opinions on other issues, but it will draw in a lot of people. And we need to advocate this in the unions and outside. Of course, the forces that do this today are small, but as Harper pointed out, there are traditions that are still alive, such as in the ILWU and Juneteenth strike. These are exemplary actions, of course, by the organized working class that can lead the way in order to show that this society needs to change and that the working class is central to it. Of course, all of this, in our opinion, as the Bolshevik tendency, requires the formation of a revolutionary party, of a party made up of broad layers of working class people that have been tried and tested in the struggle, that represent the best traditions of labor struggles and socialism, not just in this country, but internationally. And that is what we want to do. And in the preparation for that, it is important to have discussions, honest discussions, with people from different tendencies, from different backgrounds, in order to thresh out the program, in order to have joint actions. Because a lot of things grow together when you work together. If you go together on a march against the KKK, you accomplished a lot on the day, but you also grow together. And I think these are things that we need to do more of, because there is a certain isolation of the left, and we need to take small but significant measures in order to overcome this. We need to work together where we can in order to move forward. I'll leave it at that.
Thank you, Christoph. And thank you for everyone for attending. I hope you all found that interesting and instructive. So that's the end of the meeting. We're probably going to be having another online forum in 4 or 5 weeks. So watch out for our website, and no doubt we'll send you an email letting you know the details of that closer to the time. Thank you all for attending, and goodbye.